Ah! A woman!
I know. Just hear me out.
All right, I'll hear you out, but you already seem to know just what it is you're wading into. The 30 FPS versus 60 FPS discussion it's like the flat earth debate of video games. More frames is better. This is a settled issue. We figured this one out a long time ago, and I'm personally a veteran of the old console versus PC debates. That's how I started this channel. And like I said, I'm willing to hear you out, but I kind of doubt that you're going to say anything that hasn't already been said before.
Bloodborne. This cosmic Victorian Gothic horror masterpiece came out back in March of 2015. The Born in Soulsborne. It was developed by From Software and their resident mastermind, Hidetaka Miyazaki. That's my boy right there.
I don't know if I have a boy. If I did, it would probably be Tabe from the Prey movie. He was way better than the crappy protagonist. Or Flushes in Balatro. Yeah, Flushes always have my back. Shout out to Flushes.
And if you have a Bloodborne fan in your life, you already know.
I do have Bloodborne fans in my life. I don't play the game myself, but I know like 4 or 5 people who all play Bloodborne and like it and have the same complaint. That the performance is terrible. Yeah, 30 FPS, maximum, but it regularly goes below that. And they say it's really jarring for the experience.
It's got the art direction, the terrifyingly beautiful bosses, the trick weapons, not a single one of which is bad, by the way, the level design, the story, the dogs, the crows, crow dogs, dog crows.
Some would take umbrage to the crow diluting the greatness that is the dog. However, I choose to think that it is the dog uplifting the crow. I'm a glass half full kind of pooch.
This thing, those random aliens in the forest, an orphan, a random god-tier castle zone you can only get to by carriage, a bunch of really badass women.
A bunch of badass women sounds pretty woke to me. Wake up, sheeple.
The best DLC ever made.
Well, Blood and Wine was for Witcher 3, and Lair of the Shadow Broker was for Mass Effect 2, and Shivering Isles was for Oblivion, so it probably isn't in Bloodborne. Do expansion packs count? Can I throw in Heart of Thorns for Guild Wars 2?
And a revolutionary combat system that rewards aggression and would go on to inspire an entire subgenre of Souls-likes.
Okay, we're gonna have to take a small detour here. This is really distracting. Women, why do you wear pants that have belt loops, but you don't wear belts? I don't understand. This is madness. Y'all do this all the time, and I don't get it. I can't wrap my brain around this. Where is there's clearly a place here for a belt. There's specifically the construction of these pants call for there to be a belt here. But y'all don't wear belts. What's going on? Obviously, on men, of course, it's inexcusable. Degenerate barbarism. With women, I just find it confusing. I don't know. I don't get it. I don't understand. I don't get it. Now, sure, I don't wear a belt, but I'm a dog. I don't wear anything. I would never put on pants with cold, lonely, empty belt loops. And the glasses aren't clothes, they're an accessory.
And it all runs at 30 frames per second.
Well, 30 FPS maximum when things aren't happening. Bloodborne is infamous for having bad performance when, there's boss fights or things occurring.
It's my favorite game of all time. My gateway to From Software games. Something that gave me a sense of control when I felt like I had none.
Really? That's not a joke, is it? If so, that's good, I suppose, in a sad kind of way.
I even got my favorite boss tattooed on my arm and named my dog after another.
Yeah, you really like Bloodborne.
So yeah, it's a masterpiece. And yet, without fail, every time I stream the game, there's at least one person who comes in and says,
"Yeah, I don't know about this game. I'll probably just wait till they release it at 60 FPS.
That's a pretty fair opinion, honestly. It is a big, big ask to have a modern gamer play a game at 30 FPS, best case scenario. 30 FPS is a slideshow. It's a PowerPoint presentation. For a gamer that has standards for performance, getting them to play a difficult game based around reaction times where split-second input delays and reading enemy animations can be the difference between life and death, that is a big ask when suddenly their game drops to 20 FPS when they need those frames the most.
And my heart breaks because everyone deserves to experience this.
Yeah, I'm sure it's a neat game. We all deserve to experience dying to a boss in Bloodborne. If you think this makes me want to play the game more, then it's not working.
Really though, the desire for Bloodborne running at double its frame rate has turned into something of a phenomenon in the gaming community.
No, it is a phenomenon. You can belittle those people all you want by saying that they're just in a big circle jerk, which would be an odd strategy when you're taking a pretty stupid position from the get-go and want people to hear you out. You even have "I can explain" in your thumbnail. Well, at least you do now because you changed this video's thumbnail. It used to be this. I still have it saved on my 4K video downloader, and it's even shown in somebody else's response to you. Your old thumbnail said 60 FPS is overrated, which, oddly enough, I kind of agree with, but for the exact opposite reason as you. I think 60 FPS is given too much value when it should be higher frame rates that we aim for in games. The floor should be higher than 60 FPS, I feel. But anyway, yes, the discussion around getting 60 FPS in Bloodborne is a gaming phenomenon. I could not care less about Soulsborne games myself. Don't play them, don't plan on it. They do not interest me whatsoever. And even I know that it's what everybody wants from a remaster, and the performance is a nearly ubiquitous complaint about the original.
I mean, just a couple weeks ago, the one and only Ben Starr said this, completely unprompted, at the Golden Joystick Awards.
Absolutely criminal that we don't have an official version of Bloodborne running at 60 frames per second.
Yeah, people really want it. Because 30 frames per second sucks balls.
And honestly, right now, in this very moment, we're closer to a Bloodborne remaster than we've ever been.
Yeah, that's true. It gets truer every moment that passes, yes.
Modders have been emulating it on PC with mild to moderate success. Lance McDonald's 60 FPS mod is a real tangible thing on jailbroken PlayStations. Not that I'd know anything about that.
I don't know why you would call the desire for a 60 FPS Bloodborne game a circle jerk and then provide all of these examples of it being a legitimately widespread phenomenon of people really wanting it.
And the game's 10th anniversary is coming up early next year, which, if you're anything like me, you expect big announcements for franchises you love on any perceivable anniversary.
Any perceivable anniversary? Like the 3rd and the 4th and the 6th?
I'm even making this video a lot earlier than I had planned because of this bullshit. Server maintenance on PlayStation's 30th birthday? Please!
I guess a lot more people than normal were logging into servers and stuff, but then again, it's Sony. They should have prepared for this and known about it. There's really no excuse.
And even if it's not tomorrow, it makes sense that they would give us an official Bloodborne PC port, remake, remaster, sequel, anything tangentially related to Bloodborne.
Well, I wouldn't really consider that copium. I think that's a very fair thing to expect. I mean, what's the common joke? It's that Sony must not like making money because they could just print it if they remastered Bloodborne for modern systems and PC. Especially with how much they seem to want to shove Horizon down our throats.
Any of that could be announced at the Game Awards next week.
It was not.
But amidst everyone, myself included, asking whether we could achieve 60 FPS, no one stopped to consider whether we should.
What? No. We have all considered whether or not we should, and with the exception of you, unanimously have decided that we should remaster this game at 60 frames per second.
I'm not afraid to say it. I think Bloodborne is at its best at its native 30 FPS.
Well, I mean, you shouldn't be afraid to say that. You should just be embarrassed to say that.
It simply doesn't need a 60 frame per second remaster. Here's why.
Well, I hope this doesn't devolve into a conversation on what the word need means. Obviously, it functions, sort of, at 30 frames per second. You can beat the game. It made a lot of money. It has a lot of fans.
But first, let's talk frame rate, because what even is 30 FPS?
It means that every second, there are 30 images that are displayed on the screen.
Well, when you see a video like this one, it's not technically a moving picture. It's 30 still images all jammed into 1 second. And our brains stitch them together to give the illusion that they're moving.
Hooray, technology and our gullible brains.
Take a game in 60 FPS and you're jamming 60 frames into that same singular second.
Yeah, but you gotta pump those numbers up. Those are rookie numbers.
What ends up happening is, with more frames to work with per second, our brains can create a smoother image.
Yep, and I love smoother images. It's what the gamer brain craves.
that neuroscience thing where our brains turn this into this, it has a name. It's called the phi phenomenon. And scientists have tried to study it further, but studying perception is notoriously difficult. Like, how do they know the blue that I see is the same blue that you see?
Well, not to get on a tangent, but it depends on how exact you want to be with the color that we see. When it comes to general colors, green, red, blue, yellow, etc., we can compare experiences. There's a reason why colorblind people know that they're colorblind, and we can prove to colorblind people that they're not seeing the same colors as the rest of us, even though our perception of color is purely subjective. And you can even trick people into seeing colors that don't exist because of the context surrounding those colors. Somebody who has never seen a Coke can before in their life will not perceive this image as having red. You can even make the argument that the Coke can is red because you are perceiving it as red. The way that your brain interprets the wavelength is what gives you the experience of color. And speaking of 10-year anniversaries, many of you might remember this image from 10 years ago. What color is this dress? You see, the brain tries to filter out the distortion effects of certain light sources. That's why we can tell what the quote-unquote real color of an object is in different levels of light. In a study released in 2016 of 1,400 subjects regarding this photo, 57% said they saw the dress as black and blue, 30% saw the dress as white and gold, and 11% said they saw blue and brown. By changing the light levels and type of light that this dress is in, it could appear the same color to nearly everybody in the test. It's a matter of how the brain interprets the dress based on the context of the light surrounding it. By the way, I perceive the dress as white and gold, so I'm in a minority there. No matter how hard I try, I cannot get my brain to see the dress as black and blue, even after confirmation of its quote-unquote real color. There is even a painting technique called cangiante, where the painter uses a different color entirely to simulate the effects of the original color in different light levels. So yeah, color in the brain is really cool stuff, really neat. Wait, what were we talking about?
How do we know that both of our human eyes both see at 60 frames per second? Do you remember this meme?
Oh boy, do I. I absolutely remember that meme. Console peasants would always say, oh, there's no point in getting a PC. I mean, the human eye can only see 30 or 60 whatever frames anyway. Going higher than that is just wasting time. It's just wasting performance. It's just wasting hardware power. But as we know, obviously, you can tell the difference between 30 and 60 FPS, and you can tell the difference between much higher frame rates as well.
It dates all the way back to 1999. So what's the truth? Well, we really don't know. Some research says the human eye sees something around 70 FPS, but other research says closer to 40.
Wait, what? 70 and 40? What? What are these studies? Now, I don't want to be Anecdote Andy over here, but hey, I'm a gamer. I game. Yeah, that's right. I'm a gamer. What about it? Anyway, I play a lot of games, all right? And I play a lot of games at really high frame rates. My monitor is 240 hertz, 240 frames per second. My old monitor, 165 hertz. The moment I plugged it in and played the first game, I could tell instantly, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that I was getting way more frames per second. And I was. It was glorious. So as far as the real-world example of playing video games at higher frame rates, we can absolutely tell the difference between way more than 70 and 40. So this first study that you flash in the background is detecting meaning in RSVP at 13 milliseconds per picture, published at the end of 2013. RSVP means Rapid Serial Visual Presentation. Participants in this test were told to detect a picture specified by a name, for example, a smiling couple, that was given just before or immediately after the sequence. This study tested the limits of viewers' detection ability by asking them to look for or recall named targets in a sequence of 6 or 12 pictures that they had never seen before, presented for durations between 13 and 80 milliseconds per picture, or about 70 to 12.5 frames per second. So a participant was given a variety of tests. For instance, in one trial, they were told an image name, like flowers or a box of vegetables or bear catching fish, and then shown a series of images that flashed by at different speeds, essentially frames per second. Then they pressed a button corresponding to whether or not that image was in the sequence that they were just shown. Now, this test doesn't really mean that the eye can detect any stimulus at 77 frames per second, but that it's generally likely that a young human, the participants were 18 to 35 years old, can, before or after the fact, tell if they detected a particular image in a series of unrelated images. Now, this is extremely different from video game frame rate and the reality that it has on your experience, right? Because the FPS influences the apparent smoothness of highly contextual images in succession, not just a random flashing image sequence that are unrelated to each other. Plus, the obvious element here being that video games are interactive. So our ability to play a game will be strongly tied to our perception of the images on screen, that our inputs made using peripherals influence what those images are and will be, and our brains can typically predict to a high degree what will happen in that game as a result of our button presses. Now, the second study you post here is Consciousness in the Universe, a review of the OR theory. That's Orchestrated Objective Reduction Theory, a highly controversial theory that claims, instead of consciousness being a product of neural connection in our brains, that it instead originates at the quantum level inside of neurons themselves. Now, I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I am a quantum physicist or a neuroscientist. I am neither of those things. I'm just a smart lay dog. So please take anything that I say regarding this particular theory as the opinions of one. I do not know what in this paper shows that a human sees around 40 frames per second. The only time that frames per second is mentioned in this paper is when the FPS of modern film and video is used, just as an analogy to describe consciousness as a series of discrete events. Now, 40 Hz is a recurring number in this theory, as it seems to be labeled as the gamma synchrony rate for normal OR conscious moments, which occur every 25 milliseconds. Here's the thing, though. I don't understand this paper. I mean, I sort of get the highlights of the abstract, but this is far beyond my level of education and specialization. I am not at all convinced that this study shows what you think it shows, and I don't think that you understand it either. If you're trying to convince me of something, then I think it's in poor form to flash a study in the background far faster than we can read it and act like science supports some claim of yours. If this theory supports what you're trying to say, you need to explain to us why it does and where.
And even then, the idea of a biological FPS is really hard to study, and it's really not comparable to an FPS on a computer monitor.
Sure, but when I upgraded my monitor from 165 Hz to 240 Hz, the difference was instantaneously noticeable. It not only looked better, it was more responsive as well. It was a clear upgrade.
But those sort of ballpark estimates, they do make sense with how we perceive varying kinds of media. Like movies, for instance, are shown at just 24 frames per second. Most of us don't think twice about that. It's just how movies are supposed to look.
That's our expectation for how movies are supposed to look, simply because that is the standard. If the standard had been different, then we would be accustomed to a different frame rate. Then, frame rates that departed from the standard would be the ones that look strange.
But then, they showed us The Hobbit at 48 frames per second. And we kind of lost our minds.
I think it was just a generally negative reception.
It looked all wrong. Too smooth. And why? Why does it look bad with more frames, even to us gamers?
Well, the Hobbit movies being at double the standard frame rate was generally disliked for a variety of reasons. It's not really that important for the sake of this video, so I'll be brief. The high frame rate version of the movies was often compared, both by many critics and audiences at the time, to video games, and to soap operas on television, which are generally shot at higher frame rates, and also to the display promos that TV screens will play at big box stores like Best Buy and everything. To many people, those are the things that are high frame rate, not films, because a proper film is in 24 FPS. That's the norm. That's what's expected. That's the standard. Deviations from that are simply odd. And while there were some who liked the smoothness of the high frame rate version, many said it made prosthetics stand out, that it was easier to see the fakeness of the CGI. They noticed the special effects a bit more. And that was used extensively in those movies, so that was a bad combination. There are benefits to shooting in higher frame rates. It's easier to see the details in the scene a lot of the times, especially fast-moving action scenes, and it can be easier to differentiate details in low-light scenes. Just a general overall smoothness. But a lot of it comes down to the creative and technical execution of how the film is constructed, being 48 FPS instead of 24. And really, mostly the issue is just that the movie standard is 24 frames per second. That's what our brains are used to, and deviations from that stand out and seem odd.
Some folks think it's because 48 frames crosses over into IRL territory. It's more similar to how our own brains and eyeballs see real life. At the very least, it's how real life is shot and shown on TV. Think newscasts, sports, reality TV, other stuff.
Yeah, because all of those things are very often shown at higher frame rates than cinema. When cinema is shown at those frame rates, it builds a connection in people's brains, and it's kind of odd, even if they don't know that's exactly why they feel that way.
A lot of that, for the most part these days, is shown at 60 FPS. So when we see Middle-earth in 48 frames per second instead of 24, this cinematic veil is lifted. It looks too real.
The issue with The Hobbit wasn't that it looked too real. Part of the movie aspect of immersion is to believe that something is real. The more real that a fantasy movie looks, the more believable it will probably be. We are just used to movie screens not having closer to real motion. Without getting autistically anal about the word too, I don't think that a movie can look too real. After all, people never seem to have a problem with the resolutions of movies getting better and better and better as time goes on. And that's moving them towards a more and more accurate representation of reality. Why would the rate of motion be any different? You live your life at an extremely high frame rate, far higher than 48. Does the existence of plays in theater productions nullify the idea that media can look too real? Have you never been able to immerse yourself in a play? Because it's not on a screen, but you're watching real people and real motion just like the rest of your existence? Would you ever want to watch a play at 24 frames per second instead of real-life motion? I certainly wouldn't. And if you were put into a virtual reality simulation, like a Star Trek holodeck, of the Hobbit movies, and perceived the experience as if it was a play happening around you, would that mean it was less immersive and less cinematic because the frame rate was too high?
One critic even called high frame rates a crime against cinema.
Oh, I don't care.
Also, consider Avatar. Parts of the new one were shot and shown at that doubled 48 frames per second. And while it wasn't as big of a deal as the Hobbit fiasco...
Probably because Avatar: The Way of Water looks a whole lot better than The Hobbit does in many regards.
Folks generally weren't a fan of 48 FPS here either. Some even saying it looks like a video game.
Okay, but what does the next sentence say? In the thing right there that you're highlighting, what does the next sentence say? 100 years of 24 FPS cinema is just too ingrained in me. People are just used to having 24 frames per second be the standard for movies. If 100 years ago or decades ago we changed the standard and stuck to it, we wouldn't have this issue. I did a little digging around myself to see what people had to say about the 48 frame rate version of Avatar: The Way of Water. Many of the complaints they had with Avatar were the same as the complaints had with The Hobbit. Namely, something that kept popping up was people saying it looked too much like a video game, or it reminded them of a video game. There was plenty of people, though, who enjoyed the 48 FPS, but they didn't like how it would switch between going from 48 to 24, because it wasn't consistent throughout the movie. Some people directly reference the Hobbit movies and say, well, the Hobbit movies did not look good at 48. Avatar looked much better and cited its graphical fidelity and the technology used. But many complaints were just as they were with The Hobbit. It doesn't look right. A film should be at 24 FPS because that's what's expected, that's what we're used to, and that is what they should be.
So yeah, frame rate in movies and TV definitely affects how we perceive what's on screen. But what about video games? I'd argue the same is true.
Well, yeah, more frames per second is just obviously objectively better in a video game, of course.
And sure, From Software certainly didn't intend to put Bloodborne at 30 FPS just to make it more cinematic and dreamlike.
Well, yeah, that's just the cope that console peasants use when their video game runs like garbage.
The processors in that base PS4 and the X-Bone were, not great. But if you watch movies like I do...
With your eyeballs?
The effect is still there, that cinematic veil.
I don't know if I like this term, cinematic veil. I've never heard it before. When I hear veil, I think that something is being obscured from me. A veil hides something. It gets in the way. And sure, veils are also decorative, in a sense. But low frame rate on a film and in cinema, it's not like a veil functions when it's on, say, a woman, and it's artistically giving a slight obscurance to her face or her features. In the sense that maybe there's a part of you that wants to pull it back to see her true beauty beneath. Or maybe the mystery and the not knowing of the face beneath is what gives it beauty, blah, 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 I don't know. We're used to films being 24 frames per second because a long time ago that was settled upon as the standard because it was the minimum frame rate that generally would always be perceived as motion. Less frames means less expensive. And way back in the day, long before the digitalization of film, that was expensive, and saving money was important. That became the standard, it caught on, it stayed. It became a sort of marker for cinema. But descriptively, not prescriptively.
And really, out of all of From Software's titles, Bloodborne would be the one to run at 30 instead of 60. It's weirder, grittier, and quite literally more dreamlike than something more classically fantasy like Dark Souls.
Wait, why is something better at a low frame rate? Because it's weird and gritty. Should we lower the FPS of all weird and gritty games to 24 to make them better? Do you have any idea how many games could be described as weird and gritty? Then you just casually throw out the phrase literally more dreamlike, as if I'm supposed to know what you're referring to with that. And I don't like the idea that the genre of classical fantasy doesn't have dreamlike qualities to them. I didn't read The Once and Future King for nothing. And assuming by classical fantasy, you aren't referring to fantasy inspired by Greek and Roman mythos. Mythos? Mythos. Mythos. Mythos.
Mythos.
Mythos. And why have you just asserted that lower FPS means more dreamlike? Why is higher FPS not more dreamlike? I don't think we know if you dream in essentially a higher or lower frame rate. And I don't think you do either. I'm not ready to just accept that dreams are in a particular apparent frame rate. I suppose this assertion relies heavily on some, intuitive connection between the two. When you say dreamlike, you think of slow and sluggish and somnambulant. Somnambulant is a good word. I like that word a lot. I need to try and find more ways to slide that into my daily convos.
And honestly, when I played Lance's 60 FPS mod after logging hundreds of hours of the game at 30 FPS, it did feel unnerving and kinda wrong.
Oh, unnerving and wrong? You mean like a dream? And Bloodborne's dreamlike, so isn't that good? You see, we can make these comparisons all day and they don't really help us out. The real commentary to make here is that if you had been playing 60 FPS Bloodborne for the entire time, then you wouldn't have even noticed it. It would have just been normal. 60 FPS doesn't bother you for thematic reasons, regardless of the cope you try to make about it. It's just a deviation from what you expect, what you're used to. I could not tell you how many hours in the days of my youth I put into Halo, Halo 2, and 3, and Reach. Those games were a pretty sizable chunk of my formative gaming years. And yet now when I play those games, yeah, I'm playing them on a PC, I'm getting hundreds and hundreds of frames, and I love it, and I don't want to go back.
It was kind of like, Uncanny Valley, or like seeing your teacher at the grocery store.
Wouldn't it be weirder to never see anyone you recognize at the grocery store? Also, this isn't really what Uncanny Valley is.
It wasn't the Yarnum I knew. Keep Yarnum weird! Let it be this fake cinematic wonderland! I don't want it to be real!
I'm realizing now, perhaps a bit late, that here you're saying that less frame rate in Bloodborne is good because it makes the game seem more dreamlike and weird and cinematic. Even though the real reason is that you're just used to playing the game at a shitty, bullshit, crap frame rate for losers. The whole reason you mentioned The Hobbit and Avatar and 48 FPS at all earlier is because people don't like when movies are high frame rate yet. And the example you gave, and that many people gave, was that high frame rates in movies, they remind them of video games, when their expectations are for a movie to seem like a movie. But Bloodborne is a video game. But you want the video game to adopt the standard of not being a video game, but instead that of a movie. It's lower frame rate. You seem to value the game's cinematic element over its interactive element, which is a necessary component of it being a game. Which does make me wonder, why do you see Bloodborne more as a movie than a game? Isn't the game element of Bloodborne far more important than its perceived cinematic quality by you? Because you seem to be, by a significant margin, the minority position on it getting a remaster and playing it at 60 FPS.
Keep Yahar'gul right where it is. Put that thing back where it came from, or so help me.
Yeah, put Yahar'gul back where he belongs, which, as we all know, is training Bruce Wayne.
No, but Lance's mod is truly awesome. It's just the weirdness is my fault.
Oh, yeah, I think so. I mean, good on you for recognizing it. I think that this is a more personal, just subjective issue that you have with the experience that most of us don't seem to be able to relate to. Like how I think the new U18 tab logo is ass. But a big shout out to E621 for putting the popular button right on the homepage so I don't have to go to posts first before I see the most popular images of the day. Saves me a lot of time during the week, frees me up for, working on my other activities.
I have special eyes.
But it's got me thinking about something bigger. Why are we conditioned to think 60 FPS is the best?
We aren't. You made that up.
Is it actually the best?
No one thinks that.
Should every single game be cramming those 60 frames into every single second?
Why do you say cramming as if 60 FPS is a high number? It's 2025. Surely our standards are such that we don't think that 60 FPS is some mythical high amount of frames, right?
I mean, there's a decently large handful of games that run better at 30 FPS than 60.
Okay, name them. Name them then. Tell me these games. Tell me these games that run better at 30 frames per second than 60. Even though by definition they run twice as bad, because they're running at half the frame rate. But go on, I'm all ears. Name them.
Speaking of large handfuls. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
You will never understand the burden of trying to fit through tight spaces with these pegs.
I mean, Final Fantasy XVI, in which Ben Starr plays the lead, might I add, runs a heck of a lot better at 30 than 60, as evidenced by the recent PC release this year.
The relatively recent PC release of Final Fantasy XVI really just showed us what we already knew. The game is difficult to run for anything. It's just a really graphically intensive and demanding game. PCs can achieve higher resolutions and frame rate, but the game's difficult to run, so many of them can't. Because, after all, it doesn't on the PlayStation 5. Take a quick listen to this excerpt from the Digital Foundry discussion on the PC release of Final Fantasy XVI.
But yeah, I think that ultimately, there is a lot of controversy around this game on PC, and I understand it. I totally do understand it. But it's really, really important to consider the fact that this is a game that was built for PS5 at 30 FPS. And on PS5 at 30 FPS, it can hit resolutions as low as 1080p. It can do 1080p 30. And that's without any upsampling.
Right.
So that's without incurring the frame time cost critically of FSR2 upsampling to 4K, which we so often see. So it is really, really heavy. It is really, really heavy. It's objectively, I think, one of the most GPU heavy games we've seen this generation. And this doesn't not even have ray tracing on console, which is pretty interesting there for it to be so heavy. But I think that for a game that looks like this, it is a very good looking game. It's just a very heavy game. So you need to come in with the expectation that, yeah, you're going to need upsampling probably to get any modicum of an acceptable frame rate. You should really set your expectations. Don't go in expecting to do native 4K 60. I don't think you could do native 4K 60 on a liquid nitrogen cooled 4090.
No, I don't think
consistently.
so.
When the game released on the PlayStation 5, it came with two modes, performance mode and graphics mode. Graphics mode would keep the frame rate locked at a very low 30 FPS, but it would look better and it would be able to remain stable there, at least. Performance mode would allow it to get up to 60, And most notably, it would reliably hit and stay at 60 frames per second during combat, except it would have to lower the graphics quality and particularly the resolution in order to do this, dropping down to 720p at times, for instance. Final Fantasy XVI is a game that doesn't run well on anything. To say that it runs better on 30 versus 60 isn't really giving the whole story. It doesn't run well, ever.
Also, the beautifully cinematic Red Dead Redemption 2 is locked at 30 frames per second on console, and some gamers even say that the horse feels floaty and weird at 60 frames.
Red Dead Redemption 2 isn't beautifully cinematic because it is locked at 30 FPS. It is beautifully cinematic despite being locked at 30 FPS, because the game is gorgeously well designed. If you are, again, trying to equate low FPS with cinematic, then it needs to be lower than 30. It needs to be 24 to be as cinematic as it can be. But something tells me you wouldn't appreciate that gameplay experience, regardless of how close to being truly cinematic it was. As for weirdos who feel that higher FPS makes things feel more floaty, I legitimately do not understand how you could feel that. Higher FPS literally and objectively translates to more responsive. It means there is less time between you getting an input into the game and you receiving the visual feedback of that input. If anything, stupid Reddit comments like that only go to show the kind of damage that this obsession with good graphics instead of good gameplay has given to people. It's made people complacent or too used to 30 FPS on consoles. I have played Red Dead Redemption 2. Not that much of it. I've played the Red Dead Redemption 2 online, and it ran pretty well on my computer, and I was really glad that it ran pretty well considering how gorgeous that game looked. I would never want to lower its frame rate, especially in a game that values accuracy with your weapons against other people in combat.
And I'm not even gonna get into the weirdness that is Skyrim at a high frame rate.
Well, you mentioned it, and got a clip of it to show in the background, so you're getting into it, even if you lie by saying you're not getting into it. Skyrim is a game held together with bubblegum, staples, and Todd Howard's optimism. Do not use Skyrim and its engine as an argument against having higher frame rates in video games. That's retarded. And as a gamer, you should know better. And Skyrim was released, 13 years ago? Back in November of 2011? You're using a shitty game with a terrible engine from that long ago as an example of why 30 FPS is better than 60 FPS today. Don't do that.
For games that can run at both or higher, we're often faced with choosing a frame rate based on stability.
I think that generally, even on consoles, if a game mode is set to run at 60, then it just doesn't look quite as good in general to keep it at a stable 60. Generally, stability isn't too much of an issue. It's the sacrifice in graphical quality, which for me, I'll take higher FPS if it means lower graphics pretty much all the time. Though again, in the background, you're using Final Fantasy XVI footage. That game is extremely difficult to run on any piece of hardware that is running it. It is a special, weird case. Should not be used as a broad example.
And I think most of us would agree that a stable 30 is way better than an unstable 60.
Out of curiosity, because I didn't really know myself what people would generally prefer, so I made a community poll on my YouTube channel, and after 8,100 votes, 70% of people said they would prefer a stable 30 FPS over an unstable 60, but the comments were filled with people asking how unstable exactly, because that would be a big determining element in which they would choose. So it seems that for a lot of people, the stability of the frame rate is a really important aspect of the gameplay experience.
And that's one frame-related criticism that I'm actually on board with regards to Bloodborne. Sometimes it dips below 30, and that's not very chill.
Well, the main issue is that a stable 30 FPS is still 30 FPS, which sucks and is garbage, and I hate it. But I don't know why you're complaining that Bloodborne drops below 30 when it's so much more cinematic the closer you are to 24, right? That's the arguments you were using earlier.
But in a game about Lovecraftian horrors and losing our minds as we perceive eldritch truths, what are those dropped frames but the filling of our IRL frenzy bars? Lest. Nah, I'm kidding.
Oh, were you? Because bad performance in video games, especially 30 FPS and below, is enough to make me go mad. That was one of the few sensible things you've said so far.
In reality, I think the best case scenario if we do get a remaster is to just let the PC version do what PC versions do best. Be ultimately customizable.
Oh, yeah. True, I agree. Yes, it should. Correct take. Yes.
PC gaming has always been about choice. And if your choice is to play it at 60, maybe my choice is to play it at 30.
Yeah, I mean, if I had a choice, I'd want to play it way higher than 60. Way higher than 60. The higher, the better. But if you want to play the game voluntarily at 30 FPS, like a freak weirdo, then sure, yeah.
Everybody wins. Now, it's not an inherently bad thing for games to look smoother at 60 FPS.
Yes, that is true.
A lot of the time, it's a downright wonderful thing.
Well, I mean, 60 FPS isn't wonderful. It's still pretty low, but it's definitely way better than 30.
And sometimes it'll make you better at a game, like for first-person shooters and fighting games with their quick camera movements and need for precise inputs.
It's so weird to, like, you're correct in that you'll be better at the game at 60 FPS for a variety of reasons. Having more information for you to work with and respond to, having your inputs be put into the game faster so you can get the feedback of those inputs faster, the fact that you can just track more accurately with aiming. It's like all this is correct. What you're saying is correct. It's just so weird that you're using 60 FPS, which is considered so low for competitive shooters in these kinds of games, to be the thing you're comparing it to. I do not want to be playing at such a low frame rate when I'm trying to consistently hit my targets in games, and that's the difference between winning and losing.
It's also an important consideration for accessibility and motion sickness.
True.
But in a Soulsborne title, frame rate isn't what's gonna help you get good.
Well, it kinda does, not to focus on the doing better versus being better issue. It will remove a barrier between you and your potential by allowing you to see more of what's actually happening in the game, instead of all the gaps between the relatively few frames you do get to see at 30 FPS. And it allows you to make more responsive inputs in the game and see those inputs with less delay. You mentioned fighting games before, which is unusual that you'd say it's important to have high frame rates in fighting games, but then imply here that you don't need them in Bloodborne, which is in essence like a fighting game. I mean, let's just look at this from the numbers perspective. The average response time to visual stimulus for a gamer is about 200 milliseconds. Competitive gamers and more hardcore gaming enthusiasts and people who play games more often, they will have a shorter time usually, but let's stick with 200 milliseconds for now. If you're playing a game at only 30 frames a second, then that means the gap in between the frame updates are 33.3 milliseconds. You're only being updated visually on what's happening every 33.3 milliseconds. Now, remember how earlier you brought up the detecting meaning in RSVP at 13 milliseconds per picture study? The one that didn't really say what you claimed it said. What that study did find is that viewers could detect and retain information about images that they'd never seen before at intervals as short as 13 milliseconds, which is faster than 60 FPS, by the way. Almost a third faster than the intervals that frames give at 30 FPS. And since response times in humans as far as visual stimuli are concerned are around 200 milliseconds, the larger the gaps in the updates that a game gives you, the less possible it is to respond to them. If an enemy, let's say in Elden Ring or Bloodborne or in any fighting game, if an enemy is about to make an attack against you and you have to respond with a dodge or a block to avoid damage, the higher the frame rate that you play at, the sooner you will begin seeing that animation and the more time you will have to react to it. At 30 FPS, you have gaps between frames of 33.3 milliseconds. At 60 FPS, it's half that time, 16.6 or so. So you get the updates twice as fast.
I do admit, dying to frame instability sucks ass, and it shouldn't happen.
Oh, so frame rate doesn't help you get good, but if the frame rate's low, you die. Okay, gee, thanks for making me fucking say all that shit again.
And they could smooth out a lot of that nitty-gritty stuff with frame pacing and capping.
Well, nothing in that game is smooth if the frame rate is 30 FPS.
But learning to read patterns, when to dodge, when to punish, none of that is locked behind an extra 30 frames.
This is just objectively wrong. Mathematically speaking, you get twice as much information at 60 FPS as you do at 30 FPS. How do you think you know when to do those dodges? You have to see it. You see twice as much at 60 frames per second. You get double the frames for you to respond to. I mean, I know we're really far into the video, but you do understand what frames per second is, right? And what that means. Yeah? Like, I know earlier you told us what frames per second were, pretty much, but do you understand what that information means?
If you're blaming your Bloodborne deaths on its frame rate, that's a skill issue.
Okay, then play it at 15 frames per second. If you can't do it? Skill issue. Just a moment ago, you complained about dying because of the frame drops. Well, it's skill issue. It's not the game. It's you. Just get better. Quit bitching.
Okay, but back to that question. Should every game run at 60 FPS? At least at a minimum.
Yeah, that'd be nice.
I think a lot of folks would say yes, but I have this fear in the back of my head that all video games are starting to look and feel the same.
Oh, are you stupid?
Like the gaming equivalent to Instagram face, where celebs and influencers are all starting to look the same, in part because their plastic surgery is mimicking the filters on social media. You know, mimicking this fake popular beauty standard.
If you're going to try and tell me that games are going to all look and feel the same because they might start running at acceptable frame rates now, I might need to take a break.
And this fear of gaming Instagram face, it's not unfounded. Bloober released their Silent Hill 2 remake this year, which I adored, by the way, but it just looks like so many games of this era. Third-person, over-the-shoulder camera angles slightly offset with this Resident Evil and or Last of Us style combat.
I mean, this all seems extremely off-topic to the video, but if you don't like those kinds of games, you don't have to play them. They constitute a very small percentage of games overall. And even within this subset of kind of game, they feel very differently. I mean, Resident Evil 4, the original, feels very different to the remaster. It feels very different than Dead Space, and they feel very different than The Last of Us. I don't... What are we talking... What's going on?
That's obviously a huge departure from the original PS2 game back in 2001. The downright wonderful Gene Park, gaming journalist at the Washington Post, he reviewed the remake back in October, and he wrote how starkly different it is going from 2001 James, leaving his bloody trail behind him after his first kill. Oh my god, my footprints! Look at my footprints! To the remake, where James moves on just like any other video game character.
Alright, that sounds like a writing issue with the remake. I don't really see what this has to do with Bloodborne remasters and a frame rate discussion.
Gene also mentions that back in 2001, Silent Hill 2's fully 3D camera was revolutionary for gaming at the time, setting it apart from old-school Resident Evil games. But now, the Silent Hill 2 remake actually mimics modern Resident Evil games. Everything is kind of getting funneled together.
You know, that's a really interesting opinion that you have there. I just don't see what this has to do with the Bloodborne remaster and frame rate discussion.
We're all the same.
And that doesn't mean it's not awesome. This game has some of the best sound design I've ever heard in video games. And the motion capture is exceptional to say the least. But the fact remains, it's pretty similar to a lot of other games made today, at least by bigger studios.
I don't know. I mean, I haven't played Alan Wake 2. I've played Resident Evil 4's remake, and I played The Last of Us, and those two don't feel anything like each other, really.
Shout out to those indie games like Balatro and UFO 50 breaking that wheel, baby. Hell yeah!
I don't know. If they make another playing card game, will you just say it feels like Balatro?
Anyway, if we push for a Bloodborne 60 FPS remaster just because that's what games should look like...
Well, it's not just about the visuals, it's about how responsive and accurate it is to our inputs, which is a pretty phenomenally important thing in a video game.
And that's what's popular and makes the studios money? We tread a dark path, I fear.
Are you fucking stupid?
And yet, I can't deny, getting anything new on that Bloodborne front is tantalizing. There were 2 environments in Elden Ring's new DLC that reminded me of Bloodborne pretty directly. And like seeing those, they fully took my breath away.
Well, shout out to Elden Ring for taking this lady's breath away. But what's this you've written up here? Even the ray of light is the same. Is this some kind of a joke? In what universe do these two rays of light look the same? They're different colors. They're at different angles. They have different sharpness. They have different shapes. How do you expect me or anyone else to take anything you say regarding visuals in video games seriously when you show these two images and say, yeah, it's the exact same ray of light? Your eyeballs don't work properly. Your vision is broken. You need to go to an optometrist and schedule an appointment. No wonder you think 30 FPS is fine. Your vision is broken.
I thought about what could be, what we could have. Oh, the sweet blood. It sings to me. And even right now as I'm talking to you, I don't really know what I want.
I want this video to be over.
I'm like Papa G, unsure if I'm going in to kiss my wife or going full wolf mode and eating her.
Oh yeah, gals love it when I go wolf mode and eat 'em. Just ask Solari's mom.
Because, like, if they release a Bloodborne PC port, remaster, remake, sequel, whatever, will I be over the moon? Absolutely. But do I also worry someone might take a crack at this and absolutely bungle it? Mangle my beautiful boy? Yeah.
Yeah, it's fair to be concerned that they might bungle a remake or a remaster. Though, if they bungle the remaster, it's not going to be because they gave you a higher frame rate option.
Of course, the Demon's Souls remake comes to mind here. Again, a totally kick-ass remake, but a lot of that original artistic intent was kind of lost in the shuffle when Bluepoint remade it. If you want to learn more about that whole can of worms, I highly recommend this series by Illusory Wall.
I think it looks better on the right.
So yeah, even if you are frothing at the mouth for 60 FPS Bloodborne...
Well, I'm not. I don't care about Bloodborne at all. But a lot of people do care, and I hope they get what they want and what makes them happy.
Jones in for that Bluepoint style remake, it should absolutely not stop you from playing the brilliant masterpiece that exists right now at 30 FPS.
Well, if I did have any interest in Bloodborne, I would just wait for a remaster. Getting me to play a game at 30 frames per second max when I know it dips lower, that's a big ask.
I think the best case scenario here, which I kind of alluded to earlier, is for the devs to tackle this the same way that the folks at Abbey Road Studios did when they remastered the Beatles albums. They used modern technology to turn those originally only mono records into these dynamic stereo albums. But they also re-released those original mono recordings in a nice shiny box set. It's the best of both worlds.
Yeah, it'd be really cool if they did something like the Master Chief Collection, where if I want to play the older Halo games, I can press a button and swap between the new graphics and the old graphics. I tend to play on the older ones because I love the nostalgic feel that they give me, but, you know, I really appreciate a lot of the new stuff.
Like if Konami made Silent Hill 2 easily playable alongside our nice new remake, or if From Software and Sony someday release a Bloodborne remake or remaster that still preserves the 30 FPS original game in there somewhere.
You say preserve 30 FPS in the same way that I would say preserving the milk that's gone off in the back of my fridge that I'm too lazy to throw out. That was hypothetical, by the way. I don't have gone off milk in the back of my fridge I'm too lazy to get rid of. When I get milk, I drink it, because I love milk. Milk is good for you. Helps build strong boners.
That's my dream. And at the end of the day, this is just my opinion. You can disagree with me.
Oh, don't you worry about that.
If you think Bloodborne is better at 60 FPS,
it is. I haven't even played it, and it is.
You're valid.
So heckin' valid.
But I encourage you to think about why that is.
Oh, don't you worry. I've thought about it a lot. I've thought about it more than most people on the planet. There's not one canine quadruped on this planet who's thought about frame rate more than me.
Don't let everything get funneled into being the same video game.
Look. You seem like a nice lady. You do. Not for a moment do I think you're some fake gamer, tourist, industry plant, none of that. You seem to have a real passion for games, and Bloodborne in particular. But this is a wacky take, alright? I'm kinda glad you reminded us all that it was here at the end of your video, because the idea that all games will just start to be funneled into being the same game if they run at acceptable frame rates, that's retarded. And, you know, we've all got our weird gaming quirks. I like playing the library more than I like playing the silent cartographer. I'm just a wacky dog, you know? And if having every game run at higher frame rates makes them feel kind of similar, then you know what? Bring it on. I'm ready for it.
And don't let it stop you from playing Bloodborne at all.
Well, bad news. It's gonna.
P.S. Ben Starr, you are so skilled. I love your work. Please forgive me for my trash talk. As a penance, I will make my next big stream game Final Fantasy VIII!
All right, I'll make sure to miss that.
Okay, bye!
And a goodbye to you, Jess Capricorn. That video was pretty bad. But you know what it did do? It reminded me of those halcyon days of yore. Back in the console versus PC days. Ooh, those were sweet, sweet times. More frame rate is a really cool thing. Give me those frames. Every single one that you can give, I will take. And if you, for whatever weird reason, want to play your Bloodborne remaster, or anything at 30 FPS, well, you know what? I guess you have the freedom to do that, you freak. You play the way you want, and I'll play the way I want, with as many frames as I could possibly handle. And while I don't care at all about Bloodborne, I know that a lot of people do, and from the bottom of my little doggy heart, I really do hope that you guys eventually get the Bloodborne remaster that will make you happy and that you will cherish until you're old and gray. And with that, I think it's time to wrap this puppy up. Before you go, please consider donating to my Patreon or to my Subscribe Star. Every single dollar I appreciate immensely. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, but maybe most important of all, every frame a pause. That's right, the podcast I run with my friends, EFAP. We do long-form media discussion and analysis. Movies, shows, games, storytelling of all kinds. We have a lot of fun, and I would really like to see you guys there. So, from me to you, I bid you adieu, farewell, and may your frame rates always be sky high.